Good morning and welcome to another edition of the Cambridge University Land Society's ESG and Sustainability Forum series, kindly sponsored by Savills. My name is Kotecha, co-founder at Amro Partners. And as chair of the CULS ESG Forum, I'm pleased to introduce the topic of this morning's session, which is captioned, Designing and Delivering Green Buildings to Green Standards that Avoid Greenwashing Claims. With under 8 years to go to 2030, our sector faces the grave responsibility to act and significantly reduce our contributions to the UK's greenhouse gas emissions from its current level of circa 25%. Whilst regulatory pressure keeps mounting and investor and occupier demands continue to grow for highly energy efficient and sustainable green buildings, as a sector, we continue to have a wide variety of opinions as to what constitutes a green building, and more importantly, a net zero carbon building. Interestingly, it seems far easier to define greenwashing than it is to define green buildings. Greenwashing is seen to occur when a company puts greater marketing efforts and greater investment into marketing its green building credentials than it does into investing in reducing the building's carbon footprint. The lack of an evidence-based approach or an auditable approach is often identified as a key problem and is referred to as a lack of green governance. Today, we bring you a panel of outstanding experts to demystify what green credentials mean and how we may actually effectively deliver on net zero pledges without falling foul of greenwashing allegations. I will now introduce our panelists and hand over to our moderator to kick off the session. We have Marilis Ramos, Director, Savills Earth Advisory at Savills Earth. Hi, Marilis. Martin Townsend, Director at the Centre of Excellence for Sustainability at BSI. Will Arnold, Head of Climate Action at the Institute of Structural Engineers. Kasper Guldager Jensen, co-founder at Home.Earth. And Louise Hutchins, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at UK Green Building Council, who is our moderator for today's session. Over to you, Louise. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Ami, and good morning, everybody. Really delighted to be sharing this session today. I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion. We were talking before as a group and we were saying no one likes greenwashing, do they? But how do we avoid it? What does it look like? And why would we want to avoid greenwashing? UK Green Building Council was set up as a response to the climate and nature emergency, and we've done a lot of work trying to bring the whole industry together to ratchet up ambition, to set new standards, to really explore what does good look like. But it's still something we're tackling from all different directions. And we've got an excellent panel today. And what I've asked them to do is start with a pitch. So they're each going to give you a 2 or 3 minute pitch, looking at what they think the big challenges are in this area. And then we're going to have a discussion. Got lots of different points of view on the panel, but also we really want to bring you in and hear your point of view. What is it about greenwashing that concerns you? What are the challenges that you're facing? And your chance to ask this great panel some questions and hear from them. So do post your questions in the Q&A box and we will try and come to as many as we can. So I'm going to over to the panelists then to hear their pitches to answer some of these big questions. So we're going to go first to Marilis.
Hello, everyone, and good morning. I'm happy to be here to talk about greenwashing. So may I have my first slide, please? Yes, thank you. So everyone's talking about ESG at the moment. Companies from all over the world are setting climate change targets, climate targets and ambitions, net zero targets and ambitions. And these potential occupiers and clients are going to be looking for sustainable ESG compliant buildings. Investors will be looking closely at this as well, which will in turn affect the ability to secure finance on projects. Everyone wants to hear about sustainability, but how much of the claims we're seeing and hearing are genuinely sustainable and how much is just greenwash? Next slide, please. greenwashing comes in many forms. And as an industry, we have to be mindful and aware of the various forms of greenwashing and make sure that A, we know how to spot it, and B, that we don't allow or enable these practices to continue. I think everyone really wants to build a green building to keep up with expectation, but sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it isn't. So things like talking about the PV on the roof of a glass skyscraper is a hidden trade-off. You're talking about the good things, but you're kind of glossing over the fact that it's not a green building in the first place. Empty claims that have no proof, empty claims that are just saying they're green or low embodied carbon without actually saying to what degree. You have to look out for those. Things that are irrelevant. So selling buildings that have high energy efficiency, highly energy efficient fabric, when in fact they're just Part L compliant, you have to do them anyway. But the lesser of two evils. So presenting a building as green, even though it shouldn't have been built in the first place. There's fibbing and there's false labels. So companies creating their own labels that aren't third-party certified is also greenwashing. Next slide, please. So it's very interesting things coming out of the EU, where the EU taxonomy is coming out exactly to combat greenwashing. So it has very clear categories. What I really like about it is that, yes, you can talk about your contribution to climate change in any of these 6 areas, but you also have to be very transparent about any activities that your business might be doing that are detrimental to the environment. So it's this discourse and the fact that you need to meet certain minimum standards across all 3 areas VSG. This kind of way of looking at greenwashing is very transparent, and we need to see more of this. And I believe the UK government has plans to adapt the EU taxonomy, although the timeline is slightly shifted. Next slide, please. And there really is no reason to greenwash. There are a lot of benefits and opportunities for doing buildings properly in this day and age. You really need to focus on buildings that have a tangible impact on what it is we are trying to achieve, which is hit our climate change targets. So you can, through not doing greenwash, you future-proof your asset against obsolescence. You make your buildings more resilient to climate change impacts. And there's also a growing awareness of the public about what it is we're trying to do here. And you have raised eyebrows if you do anything slightly greenwashy, and you'll have to answer to them as well. And obviously there is a tangible financial incentive, given the energy crisis, for going green, especially for occupiers. There are so many perfectly good reasons to just do a proper job and build inspiring, truly sustainable buildings. Sustainable buildings have benefits not just for the planet, but for a company's reputation. And these days, it means significantly reduced running costs, not to mention all of the social and productivity benefits. Thank you.
Good stuff. Thanks very much. Okay, so we're going to go over to Will Arnold next.
Hi, yes, I can have my first slide up, please. So, oh, that's not me. Do you want to go to me, or do you want to go to
Martin?
Let's go to Martin then.
We'll go with Martin.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to take a slightly broader perspective, I suppose, in terms of unpacking this debate, because what we need to do as panelists is to kind of tease you and inspire you. So where I'm coming from is, if we look at the nature of our industry, it's incredibly fragmented. So if we look at the top right hand and those bullet points, those 10 bullet points or so, we have a very diverse range of interests. And I think when we start to kind of try and answer the question that the Cambridge University Land Society has asked us, we need to appreciate the nature of the industry we have. It's fragmented. We often look at the lowest possible bid when it comes to building our new stock. We need to make sure that we think about the risks in terms of how we are working with everybody in that supply chain. And we need to make sure that we're really thinking about not just our new stock, but our existing stock. Our ultimate goal, and this is hopefully the reason you joined us on this webinar, is about making sure that we drive low impact, net zero, and actually you can even argue beyond net zero, making sure that we are creating buildings that can adapt to our future needs. Our real estate needs have changed dramatically over the last few years. And this isn't just about a conversation about net zero. This is a conversation about market transformation. And in that, we need to make sure that we appreciate, as people that work in this sector, Is this driven by voluntary standards? Is this about driving change because the industry wants to be the best? Or do we need regulation? And I think that becomes an incredibly important conversation about what are the drivers for change? How do we make sure that we understand that we can make our built environment the best? And how do we make our sector the inspiring sector that drives and brings new talent? That's about making sure that we have more integrated ways of working. That's about all the people that Maris has already talked about in terms of investors, architects, design engineers, tenants, landlords. It's about making sure that we innovate quicker. If we look at some parts of the built environment, our rate of change is quite slow compared to other sectors. We need to make sure that change happens quicker in a lower risk. And that basically means we need different business models. We need to think about things like circularity. We need to think about moving from a product economy to a service economy to an experience economy. We've got a lot to do. This isn't just simply about a silver bullet around creating a single framework. This is about industry transformation. Next slide, please. So I was digesting, when I was putting these slides together, all of the various frameworks out there, and there are multiple frameworks. But actually, the reality is they occupy probably 5 key ingredients. And if you are starting this journey about thinking about becoming net zero, you're probably in the assess, reduce and manage phase of that process, underpinned by a range of international ISO standards. If you are a more mature organization that are thinking about how you drive change, probably the most important ingredients, and Maris has already picked this up, is about making sure that you use assurance and validation, because one of the key things which will be transformation in our industry is transparency. No longer can you hide behind false claims. This is the issue that Cambridge have put forward. This is about greenwashing. Actually, how do you validate your claims to make sure that you are doing things in a way that can be certified, that can be validated? So my kind of hypothesis, I suppose, to kind of tease you is we have the tools. Diversity of frameworks is a positive thing. It's about the mechanism and the sequence in which you use them to drive the change you want to see. So thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Martin. Over to the next set of slides.
I think that is
check that is Will.
I think so. Can we go forwards, please, to the next slide? Thank you.
Great.
So I'm going to come at this from the very other end again to Martin. I'm going to focus in on something quite specific. So I'm a structural engineer, which means I want to talk to you about how we avoid greenwashing when we use materials. And this is my favourite equation, which I'm sure you'll agree is perfect for 8:30 in the morning. And this is the equation for how you calculate something called embodied carbon. And embodied carbon is the emissions related to making and using our materials. And to calculate it, you need 2 things. You need the bit on the left, quantity, so how much material you're going to use, and the bit on the right, the carbon factor, which tells you how carbon intensive that material is. And if you can reduce either of those, or better still, both of them, you'll reduce the embodied carbon emissions of your materials. And in a typical new build project today, about 1/3 of the lifetime emissions for that building will be embodied carbon, and in a very low energy building, it will be much higher than that. So we want to reduce this. The problem, though, is that reducing quantities of materials is seen as being quite hard, because that's the bit where we need to reimagine how we build stuff, right? So that's through reusing existing buildings, exploring circular economy principles, keeping our structures simple and short, avoiding basements, things like that. These are tricky decisions that you have to try and make early on with the design team. And it seems a lot simpler to just use lower carbon materials. At least that's the conclusion a lot of people might be coming to. So can I have my next slide, please? I think you might have to just click a couple of times so we get all 4 images up. Thank you. So the problem with relying on low carbon materials, though, in my opinion, is that there kind of isn't any such thing out there today. There will be. It'll be coming, and by the 2030s, this set of slides will be very different. But right now, we can't rely on them. Broadly, there's 2 types of technology we consider as low carbon. So some stuff, like the bits on the left of this image, are things that you can buy today. You could use it on your project right now. You could pour it in the ground. You could erect some steel frames with it. And the production of those materials does emit less carbon than typical materials. So that all sounds quite good, right? But the problem with this is that these sorts of things that you can get hold of today typically rely on using what we would consider to be waste materials within their composition. So this is the use of scrap steel to make new steel, and it's methods of producing concrete that use waste products from other industries. The problem with this, because that all sounds quite good so far, the problem with this is that there's sort of global supply issues. So we consume about 3 times as much steel as exists in scrap form, and we make about 10 times as much concrete as we could make out of these waste byproducts, and we fully utilize the supply of those waste materials that's out there already. So if you use them on your project, it just means somebody else can't use them, which means that whilst your project might appear to be lower carbon within the sort of system boundary of your project, the reality is that global emissions don't decrease. That's the bit on the left. The bit on the right, these are like true innovations with new abundant stuff that we could use to solve this problem. But you can see from the marketing images the sort of scale that these are currently at. They fit in the palm of your hand typically. So they're kind of stuck in the lab at the moment. So we have these large scale, low carbon products that don't reduce planetary emissions, and small scale stuff stuck in the lab that we can't use on site yet. And I've got solutions for both of this, but I'm going to save those for when we get to the discussion. Thank you.
Good stuff. Thanks very much, Will. Okay, and over to Casper then. Casper not here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there we go.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Yeah, I'm. You could say like I've been a sustainability pioneer, working as an architect for 2 decades. And 2 years ago, I went to the dark side and became a developer, trying to actually be able to set the direction from the starting point, because I think we need to ask for the right questions in order to be able to provide the right answers. Last year in Denmark, where I'm located, the ombudsman put down by law that you cannot greenwash. It's greenwashing if you don't document your sustainability action. So now you can actually sue companies or products that are claiming, green merits. And I think that's interesting. So my pitch would be, it's not about what you say, it's about what they say. How can you kind of third party verify your statements? My company, we state that we want to be planet positive. We want to work with circular construction, and we want to kind of increase biodiversity in our developments. So next slide is, how do we then come about sustainability? We use a lot of frameworks and a lot of reporting schemes, but I think basically I want to go from a relative way to address sustainability to an absolute way. And I think the only way I can find is, how can we live within the limits and the boundaries of the planet? So we are inspired by the British economist Kay Raworth, who developed the framework for the donut economy 10 years ago. So I think the framework is based on the planetary boundaries, a scientific framework developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center. So we are lucky enough to work directly with Kate and the Stockholm Resilience Center on actually saying, how can we downscale the planetary boundaries for climate impact or for biodiversity? How can we downscale that to a personal level and upscale it to, you can say, a personal budget? So what is your budget you can spend on housing, on flying, on food? And that is, that's absolute, because then we are actually giving an answer that is based on, the limits of the planet. And I think the interesting part is that it's not like carbon zero, because the planet can do some carbon uptake in the oceans, in the forests, but it's far from where industry is now. So the scary part of the message is that we need to reduce by a factor of 20 our carbon impact in the industry today. And I think the answer we are working with is LCA, the life cycle assessment. And that has, as of this year, become mandatory in Denmark. So all new build needs to have LCA assessment, and also need to stay within certain thresholds. So I think those two messages is that you need to have your claims third party verified. It's what they say. And also that you need to document your things and actions within limits. And we go with the planetary framework. In Denmark, we have legislation. It's not ambitious, but at least it's an ambitious start. Thank you.
Thanks, Kasper. So I think we've seen some very specific look right down at the detail of the materials all the way through up to the planetary level, and the context for our industry. Certainly in Britain, the built environment is the second biggest source of emissions, and we have a huge responsibility to contribute to meeting net zero. But I think this wider donut economics approach helps us look at what do we mean by greenwashing? What do we mean by green? I think certainly from the UK Green Building Council, our vision of green is not just zero carbon, it's also nature positive and restorative, but it's also putting people at the centre and the social value, the social justice. And I think that's what's so great about Kate Rayworth's work. She puts people and the planet together in this amazing model. And I think that's what we all need to be looking at when we're trying to think about the buildings that we're constructing, that we're renovating, and what green looks like, and what sort of the issues around greenwash. They're quite holistic and can't just be sort of taken through one plane or another. So building on that, Kasper, sort of how did you come to start using this model around donut economics, and what made you link that between sort of this wider concept and the work that you were doing? Was it part of the Danish law that you were talking about, that means that you have to document action? Where did this come from?
Well, my journey started with meeting William McDonough and Michael Baumgart, the authors and the minds behind the cradle-to-cradle thinking. So that was an early discovery for me as an architect. And I actually spent 2 years with them to make a manual of how you can apply cradle-to-cradle thinking to the built environment. So I've had the duality of like taking, sustainability frameworks and try to make them into reality. Because after that, I went into the circular economy because I like how it was focusing on the economy part of the solutions. And that makes us able to scale whatever we do. And then actually was a natural, you can say, step to look into the donut economics because it, as you say, has a social foundation. So I think it's this duality that you need to have like this absolute way of living within the planet, but also do it with a social foundation. So I actually contacted Kate, and now we are doing a framework that's called the Donut for Urban Development that we will launch here in June 2nd as of this year. So I'm right now breaking it down with her on how to measure social impact in the urban development area, and also with Stockholm Resilience Center on how to report on this boundary framework. I think one key learning is that there are 9 planetary boundaries, but there are 2 core boundaries where under the other serves as support boundaries. So I think the 2 core boundaries for urban development is the climate change and is the biodiversity. So that was a learning for me. Those are 2 major crises that we need to address in everything we do.
And in Denmark, so you're saying that there's laws against greenwashing that need to document that. And Marilis and Martin, you both talked about the importance of transparency, of being able to be held up to some scrutiny. And what does that look like? Marilis, from your point of view, what do we need in this country to avoid greenwashing? Do we need certification? What does that look like?
I think we need data. So we're always shying around. I just told the client the other day not to stick our heads in the sand, which is, and I think this is what we have to do. We have to encourage the people we work with that you can't just make empty claims. What are the numbers so that we can compare things with each other so that we know how good we're getting? So it's not just the certification, but the true intent of actually knowing what the numbers are and be willing to change an approach if you're not hitting your targets.
Can I add?
Yes.
Can I build from that? There's a lot in that question, but I agree that this change that we're seeing is about transparency. So if we're going to be anti-greenwash, it's about making sure that we make better informed decisions. So if I kind of build from that question, it's about a different way of thinking, isn't it? So if we think about the procurement process, and I raised this in my kind of 2-minute pitch, we're very much driven by cost, but can we not think about things like reverse bidding? So if we're starting to think about the performance of an asset, you know, what is the cost? What is the quality of what we're asking for? And then the ultimate question is, and how can you build me that asset at the lowest possible impact? So picking up on Casper's point and Will's point, using the principles of reverse bidding to challenge our suppliers and to challenge architects to say, I know what I want, but I want to get it delivered in the lowest possible way. So this issue about kind of driving change is a different way of thinking. It's about making sure that we have data and our processes are designed in the right way. So if we think about some of the design processes, they're quite shallow at the start. So we think about some of the energy modeling that we do for our built environment at the design stage. We don't invest as much time as we need to sometimes. And as a consequence of that, further along the process, when that building becomes operational, actually that lack of investment of time in terms of effective energy modeling or effective use of BIM means that our building isn't as good as it can be. So making sure that we validate and we use good data to drive the process, both from the procurement process, from the design process, becomes fundamental.
If I can come in as well, I think we need to talk a bit or think a bit about purpose as well within all of this, because I think the reference to donut economics was the right one, and I keep this on my desk. This is how much I think this is brilliant. And always one to outdone. Yeah, okay. But Kate Raworth in donut economics talks a lot about systems thinking. And a lot of sort of, regenerative practitioners talk a lot about systems thinking. And if you read into systems thinking, the biggest lever for change is to do with the purpose of a system. A football team whose purpose is just to meet up on Saturday and have fun will be very different to a football team whose purpose is to win the World Cup. And once you've set a purpose, all of those other millions of decisions that follow will be very different depending on that purposes. And I think we have to ask ourselves what the purpose of the built environment is in this country and overseas. Is it there to make return on investments for the banks who fund the construction of the built environments, or is it there to provide benefits to people and planet? Not do less harm to people and planet, but to provide benefit to people and planet, which also comes up in donut economics. And I think it's worth taking inspiration from models like B Corp in terms of the sort of benefit that our companies can bring. And I think we could take inspiration from humanitarian sector work and not-for-profit sector work, because they're driven by a sort of purpose of doing good rather than a purpose of acting as, a way of generating a return on investment. Maybe that's too big for us to actually be able to solve today, but I think it's worth talking about.
It goes to the heart of the question, doesn't it? Because the industry is driven by the bottom line, but how can we introduce other objectives into that? And there is going to be a tension, isn't there, between green and the social value. So Casper, back over to you.
Yeah. I raised my hand there because I think it's a core message that the purpose, the nature of what we do is key. Also is key when I actually work with Kate Raworth, that the business model is like what is in center in order to drive the change. So we are also purpose driven, also B Corp pending. We're a new company, but in that way, I think it's important to say that how we try to set it up, you can call it the triple bottom line. We also say we want to serve the whole. So we are serving our investors with a return, but we actually share the return. So also, like the tenants of our buildings are getting a part of our value creation. And also the cake is cut up, so we also pay back nature. We allocate money for the sustainability in the construction up front. So it is about challenging the business models. But I also would like to challenge the statement about we need to look at the NGOs, because we also need to make commercial business, like scalable business. And I think that's the tricky part. And what we've set out to do is try to make a scalable business model that serves all stakeholders. Because I think scale, that's at least my own learning throughout my career, that you can talk about sustainability, but if you don't scale it up, it does not impact. So I think that's just a message here.
Yeah, we're not in it for fun. Has to be done at scale as well, because of the the scale of need to transform our industry. This can't be a minority sport, can it? It has to be something that everybody, the whole industry, engages in. And Martin, you talked about the industry being very fragmented, and part of the role of UK green building councils and all of the green building councils across the world is to try to bring industry together, to learn from each other, to take the best practice in one place and populate it across the industry, and share those experiences, share the battles, and work out how we overcome them, ramp up that level of ambition. But competition is important as well. Martin, from your point of view, where would you sort of see the most progress coming? Do you think competition is a powerful driver in this?
Completely. I actually think, there is a conversation that's often had, which is, we just need one way of managing carbon in our buildings. And I always get frustrated by that, because this conversation today has already demonstrated there's a diversity of thought, there's a diversity of routes. Competition between different organizations, different standards is actually a positive thing. It helps and gives the market space to choose. If you're an SME, the route you might take be different from a corporate. So I think competition is a positive thing. I think where we fail sometimes is that there is a lack of clarity. So sometimes we do need commonality around things like measurement. So what we mean by net zero becomes important, getting those common metrics and allowing different tools to actually support different organizations or different geographies in different ways, I think is a positive thing. So it is about making sure that we are all pointing in the same direction, but diversity of the marketplace is important. I wanted to build a little bit by just throwing something in as well, which is we do need to think as professionals around how much is sort of in the hands of the user and how much is in the hands of the organization setting a standard or setting a framework. And I think one of the challenges which is important is that we do need to make sure as these standards are created or these frameworks are created, they are Paris compliant. So they're not helping and supporting businesses to improve, to actually meet the terms of the Paris Agreement and to achieve net zero and beyond, then actually we need to question those. So your point about transparency and greenwashing is we have a role as professionals to call out those that are not supporting those aims. And actually that's where the commonality comes. Can we all say that our frameworks, our standards, our networks are actually supporting that pathway to the Paris Agreement?
That's really important. UK GBC, we've produced this roadmap to decarbonise the whole of the sector, showing where emissions have been and where they need to be. And our latest project is working with a really broad section of industry to set out a new net zero standard. So how low carbon should these buildings be? What are we trying to achieve in the different archetypes? And it takes the overall carbon budget for the sector and splits it between different types of houses, large office blocks. So from the top down, what budget should each type of building have? And from the bottom up, what's possible and what's technically feasible? And hopefully that sort of will help create a kind of framework that we can all move towards, but that is Paris compliant, as you say.
The one thing just to add, let's not see net zero to be the end goal. Let's just see it to be a step on the journey, because as Casper's already said, there is life beyond net zero in terms of being positive. Yes. So a lot of people go, oh, I'll get to net zero and that's it. No, it's not. There is a much bigger conversation.
Meryl, it's over to you.
So I think just picking up on what Martin said about the certifications, the frameworks, and linking it with the idea of purpose. So I think it's tricky using certifications as an end goal. It shouldn't be, because what happens is people just tick the boxes and they're like, okay, job done, we've done it. But actually, if you have purpose in your mind, you realize that some of the decisions you've made don't actually make any tangible positive impacts. They just given you a tick to get that score so that you can market it as something. So I think it is we have to keep it in the front of our minds that a certified building is great, but it is not the end goal. It is not a design tool. We also have to think about human-centered design. What is the end goal, the purpose of a project?
Sure. Just Casper.
Yeah, well, there were a few things. I mean, I like the 1.5 Paris Agreement target, because that actually stems from the planetary boundary of climate change. So we stay within the Holocene and try to stay away from the Anthropocene. But I also think there was I think it's super important to document what we do, and also to make action now. So I think maybe that's a last input from me. I think there were some talks. I guess you get the word next, Will, but you said something we can't really. Doesn't matter if we do something with recycled materials now, because in the bigger scheme, you know, like the budget stays the same. Or I think it's very important that we make actions and also keep very ambitious targets. And I think we need to do that to inspire others and also to show that it's possible. We try to show that there's a business model, but there's also a lot of others try to show that you can make circular buildings or you can increase biodiversity. And I think these kind of regenerative targets and planetary framework targets are very strong targets. So that's very important that we need to act now, because this climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis is something that cannot wait for 10 years for new materials to be invented or for legislation to follow up. So I think that is important to act now. And it's also important because it inspires others and it shows solutions that can scale other to follow.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Will, I'm just looking at some of the questions in the chat here, and Matthew Punchin is asking about greenwashing, where the owner-occupier convinces themselves that the embodied carbon of their existing building will be magically used by someone else, and so that helps them justify a new build. And you've been looking a lot about, and in your presentation, you were talking about the challenges around embodied carbon, and that the fact that there are no just zero carbon materials out there at scale that can be used. What's the way forward on that?
It's a big question. Yeah, so no, it's a good one though. So if I touch back slightly on Martin's point to give some context to this, when we talk about net zero, we're not just talking about the end point of getting to the point where emissions are balanced out with absorptions. That's where we've got to get to by 2050 or sooner. But the path to how we get there is the really important bit, because if you have a graph of emissions, and today we've got a lot of them, and by 2050 there'll be very little of them, the area under that graph is the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And to stay within a 1.5 degree aligned trajectory, that area actually has to be quite small. You actually end up with a sort of concave curve, the shape of a slide. You don't end up with something that goes along and then drops down. And most parts of the material industry, when they set out their roadmap as to how they get to net zero, they're doing the latter. They are saying, actually, we're going to find it really hard to decarbonize at any rate of speed right now. And for the next 10 years or so, we're going to be up here, and then we're expecting things to kick in later. And whether it's through something like carbon capture, which is not going to be here tomorrow, but might be here in 10, 20 years time, or whether it's just because we've got stuff that's in the lab, like those innovations I showed, but to get something out of the lab, get it standardized, scaled up and onto your sites, that takes 10 years alone. So the problem on materials is that stuff's coming, but it's over here. And yet you've got to get your total emissions to line up to this slide shaped graph. So the only way you can do that is to use less material in the short term, and quite dramatically. So when we've been looking at this for the standard that Louise mentioned, the net zero carbon standard, and hopefully the link to that's been reposted in the chat for the audience to see. But the big question on embodied carbon has been about, we know where we are today on emissions, and we've done that through data collection that we've been picking up. We know where we've got to get to. How can you be sure that you can get onto this slide if you set that as a set of limits for people? Because to Martin's point, it doesn't work as a standard if it's not 1.5 degree aligned. So the embodied carbon limits have to be science-based. And so we're trying to understand at the moment the feasibility of using less material to get started on that curve before those new low carbon materials come in. And all of that, it's kind of predicated on reuse and then efficient use of new material, where you do have to have new material. I'm not sure if that's answered the question, Louise, but hopefully it's at least talked around it in a way that's interesting.
No, and I'm just looking at the chat as well, and there's lots of questions here about shouldn't we be putting more effort into producing low carbon materials, moving away towards natural materials, and shouldn't that be a really big emphasis of our industry and indeed from government to be supporting that?
It really should. I mean, we need wartime levels of R&D into new materials, because it's the only way to bring forward that point in time where materials start to rapidly decarbonize. Is just throw research at it. I mean, in the concrete sector, there's probably 100 or so innovations out there in lab stage, many of which show a lot of promise, and only a handful of them have got the funding that they really need because they've got lucky with pitches at one point in time. We've got people in Imperial College in the middle of London developing, cements that are carbon negative, and they really are carbon negative, but at the moment they're mixing it by a bucket in the basement of a lab. I mean, it's going to be years before it gets out with that investment. So yeah, we really do need a sort of push on this. Otherwise, we're not going anywhere for a decade.
And we're having questions here about surely the location of the buildings matter as well. It's not just what you build and what you build it from. It's where it's built and making sure that it's part of locations that are not car dependent, and the overall landscaping, and obviously not having an impact on ancient woodlands and so on. Clearly, there's a big role for planning system to be brought into line with the environment and net zero goals as well. I wanted to come back to Marilis about certifications. What do you think the way to go is from here? What would you like to see if you were put in charge tomorrow? What kind of certification approach would you take?
Well, I think design shouldn't be driven by certification. I'd like to see design teams working towards buildings that are green, and they're doing it, and that they do the certification and it just naturally ticks the box. It's not driven by the certification. It is, they're getting the certification because they're already doing the right thing, because their design ethos has been set out at the beginning and everyone's working towards the same goal.
That's really, and this is a recurring theme, isn't it? That the really strong sense of purpose is what needs to guide us, as Will's great football team analogy. How do we get to a place where at the moment the industry is driven by profit to being driven by a different set of values? Certainly, in our organisation, we put a lot of emphasis on leadership courses and training and changing that mindset, and trying to inject this idea of people and planet coming first as a core motivation. How do we get to that position? I'll go to Martin, then Marilis.
I was going to take Will's kind of phrase and add, which is, it's not just about purpose-driven organisations. It is purpose with impact, and therefore the trick is, how do you actually measure the impact you're trying to achieve? There's some great work that's being done by Harvard University and Oxford University at the moment with actually that in mind. So if you're a purpose-driven organisation, regardless of what you're trying to achieve, how do you measure the impact of the actions you take? And I think that's the heart of the issue here, isn't it? Is that I can say I'm a purpose-driven organisation, but if I can't then demonstrate that the actions I take are having the impact that I want to communicate with my shareholders and my stakeholders, I can't really say I'm purpose-driven. And I think that is the next evolution of some of the conversations we're just starting to have now, which is, how do I make sure that I can transparently communicate the impact I have, be it through the kind of improvement of, the 6 capital model in terms of, intellectual capital, environmental capital, social capital, human capital, whatever it might be. How do I demonstrate that me as a brand, and that could be a building or that could be an organization, is having a positive change. So if you pick up what we've been talking about, which is how do we become planet positive, every organization has a role to play there. Every organization should be purpose driven, but they have to communicate effectively the impact and the change they want to drive.
Yep, and we have a comment in the box from Nazifa Rafa, who's saying surely there's a role for social science and humanities researchers in this as well, because it's not just about data collection, is it? It's the qualitative as well as quantitative. Marilis.
So going back to your question about I've forgotten it now, about the what was it? Profit driven. So the discussion about being profit driven and how do we deal with that? I think so much has changed in the past 2 years. The rise of ESG has now meant that sustainability is equal to value, because what we're seeing is that if you are not producing a building or letting a building that has those credentials, that has that green ethos behind it, you will be left behind in the market. And a lot of our clients at Savills are very conscious of this. So a lot of that is driven by both profit and the desire to do good. So I think for the longest time, people have always wanted to do good. But this linkage between ESG and investing and ESG parameters to development has meant that they now have a reason to go back to their boards and say, we have to do this because. So it's been a really great time. I've seen a lot of movement and a lot of change, and I've been in this industry for almost 20 years now. So it's amazing to see.
That's really interesting. And from our point of view, we've seen our membership double in the last 3 years. So there's really strong interest. I was on a panel yesterday at a Property Week magazine event with Grosvenor Estates, and they were saying that they survey the occupiers of their buildings on a very regular basis, and before COVID about 50% said that they made it a priority and they were interested in having environmentally friendly buildings that they used. Now it's up to 95%. So there really is a strong demand for this, and the level of scrutiny that property managers, property owners are coming under, I think is just soaring. Will, over to you.
Thanks. I wanted to come at this also from the angle of that I'm aware that out of the 200-ish people listening, not everyone's going to be able to change the direction of their company, and they might be thinking, great, where does that leave me? And I think what Marilis and Louise, you just picked up on is about this sort of social change we've seen in the last few years, about this sort of recognition that environmental issues are much more the forefront of the normal person's mind, and people want to do something about that now. I mean, this all to me started when the school strikes happened back in 2019. We've got a lot of strikes happening today, haven't we, actually? It's funny.
Yes.
And basically that to my mind was the start of people standing up and saying this really matters to us as a topic. And I think that if you're wondering what you can do about this and you don't sit on the board of your firm and so on and so forth, just talking about the importance of these issues is a really good place to start. Having transparent conversations about what you would and wouldn't like to see on these topics is really important. And I think that if you're ever in the position where you have the opportunity to turn stuff down and say no to stuff for environmental and social reasons, actually shouting about that from the rooftops is really important, because that's how you create social change. You make it normal to say no to doing the wrong type of work. And I've had a few conversations with people recently who've said, oh, we turned down such and such a job because it didn't align with the environmental credentials that we want to try and achieve as a company. But they keep it to themselves. They don't want to talk about it because they're worried about, reputation and all that kind of stuff. But we need to create that social change, and we need to enable people to say, no, we don't work like this anymore. That's how we worked in the year 2018. We do things like this now. And I think that's about bringing things into normality. And that just comes about from talking about things, I think.
I love that. That goes to, it's everybody's responsibility, isn't it, to drive the pace of change and to be the one that stands up and does the right thing. I'm going to go to Mara. We've just got a relatively few number of minutes left now, so I'm going to kind of do a little sweep round with any sort of closing comments from our panelists, advice from our panelists to the large number of people tuning in for this. What's your advice to people listening in? I know that we have some very senior executives on the call, all the way through to people who are quite new in their career. And I think we'll set the tone very strongly about the bravery that we need to see from everybody, and everybody taking the responsibility that they can in their different roles. Marilis.
So I guess as a final thing, I'd reiterate what I said, that it is a good business decision to do things properly. We don't need to greenwash. And in fact, doing it the right way has a lot more benefits than it is to spend that marketing budget on just making something look green, as opposed to making it truly green.
Great. Very short and succinct. Thank you. Casper.
Yeah, I was a little inspired by like what actions can you take. I think like the two biggest actions you can take in general is like choose a country to live in where, you know, like the society is geared towards sustainable, you can say, policies. That might be hard. The other one is also just to choose a pension that is geared toward green investments, and that comes back to the whole EU taxonomy now, that we need to be able to verify how we invest our money, or if we are an investor. So so that definitely actions, and also transformations in the economical environment that leads to documentation. So those two actions are actually documented to be the biggest actions you can take with impacts for the greater environment.
Thank you. And Martin.
Right. Interesting question. What would I say? Be more inquisitive. So I think what this panel debate has done is that there's a great breadth to this conversation, but for those that are listening, go away, be more inquisitive in terms of what you're buying, what you're specifying, what you're occupying, and then make a decision about what one thing can you do in the next 12 months to drive the performance of your assets, your supply chain, to be better from a carbon perspective. Don't make it complicated. Just take one business decision to be better in the next 12 months than you are at the moment. And that is about driving change, being inquisitive, and actually communicating among your teams, among your peers, about the change you want to see.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists. It couldn't be a more urgent question, could it? We heard from both COPs at the end of last year that nature is in free fall, and now pretty much every ton of carbon that's emitted needs to be returned. And we've got to act quickly. This is about transformation. This is not about incremental acts. So those last words of advice, I think, were really important, about being purpose driven, not tick boxing, but we do need to document it. We need to make sure that we're transparent and we can be open to that scrutiny, and that scrutiny is a really positive driver. And actually there's a lot of energy from consumers now wanting us to go further and faster. Be inquisitive, ask those questions, and be the one to stand up and make the decision and say no to things that aren't right, and encourage things that are more ambitious, and also talk about it. Make this normal, make this feel exciting, and make this industry feel like part of the answer rather than the problem. It's been a great discussion. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I'm going to pass back over to Ami now for some closing comments.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Louise, for moderating an excellent session, and for all your transformational insights. I hope you didn't mind me just beavering away while you were all talking. I was furiously taking notes because you said you passed on some real nuggets there. So just to quickly recap in 2 seconds or 2 minutes, not only is there no reason that we can't take action to be transparent and build our evidence base, but it is absolutely an imperative. Like Louise said, nature is in free fall. We need to act now, and we need to act big. I love the way that you addressed and you talked about the elephant in the room, which is our Achilles heel as a sector, the very fragmented nature of our value chain, and how does that impact our ability to be green? And I think you addressed it wonderfully by giving us all a call to action to apply some fresh systems thinking to that, and that is indeed critical. We need to become more performance focused and more purpose focused, as you said, rather than compliance driven. And we need to stop ticking boxes, and we really need to start making a difference. And that's so critical, and a fantastic call to action that you all gave from your own experience, which was wonderful. I also like the fact that you asked regulation to be more on point, and you talked a little bit about what good regulation looks like you did in Denmark. I mean, should the UK government be issuing a simple health warning where we all need to put up a big badge outside large-scale developments to say what our contribution is to the world's carbon footprint? I think that would be a great start, and why not? The New York local law 33 already does that. And I think it's those small actions that actually bring that thinking and that conversation into the room very centrally where it belongs. We also could have, a health warning like we have had very effectively with the tobacco industry. That's something that the building industry should consider as part of a solution, that we need to all be saying what we owe to the world in terms of good indoor air quality, which is almost a human right in my view. So I would like to end by saying that the sticks are coming thick and fast, but like the panel has done so wonderfully, you've dispelled the fear about greenwashing and put the opportunity of green credentials back into the room for everybody. There's a framework, there's a methodology out there that applies to you all, no matter what the size of your organization or your personal ambition, that you can use to make a change today. And I think that we couldn't end with a better call to action. So thank you very much, all of you. And thank you to all our listeners. I hope you continue to attend our ESG webinars and to listen from these wonderful experts that we like to bring together. Thank you from CULS and from Savills for joining us today. Have a good day.